And I'm delighted that we've got Richard Fox, who's one of the authors at Mr. Watchmaster, to moderate the panel session. So I'm going to now hand over to Richard, and I hope it's going to be a great session. So over to you, Richard.
Excellent. Thank you, Andrew. Really appreciate it. Well, thank you very much for joining the session. I really appreciate it. So we're going to talk about the art of collecting. I'm just going through a few quick notes here, and we've got two absolutely superb panel members who are going to join us for the session, whose combined experience in the auction market makes them tremendously knowledgeable about the auction market, particularly or related to watches, because that's the area of they've worked in. But beyond that, their current roles have been in consulting or are in consulting currently, private sales, research and writing, and this greatly broadens their insight into the topic that we're going to talk about and gives them a unique insight into collecting and the market in general. So our two panelists, well, firstly, as Andrew said, my role is as an auction reporter. I write about auctions of clocks and watches or anything horological, which has given me a great insight in sort of the market and talking generally about different types of collecting across different ranges of watches and as the horological items. I'm going to first introduce Paul Maudsley. Paul comes to us as a specialist. Hi, Paul. Welcome. And Paul is a specialist watch expert. 20 years, he has 20 years experience at director level of watches for both Bonhams and for Philips international auction houses. He now runs his own successful business, Remontoire Limited, and looking after private sales of fine watches and cars as well. So a nice broad aspect of that. Paul has handled over 25,000 sales of 25,000 watches across 3 continents. So he knows a lot about watches and has achieved numerous world record prices for watches that he sold at auction, Patek Philippe and other watches. He has a passion for watches, but also for motor cars as well, and as attends many events across Europe, or had pre-COVID, I guess it would be, attended many events across Europe, from concourses to races, following his passion for both for cars and also for watches. Paul, welcome along. Really great to have you with us.
Thank you for having me here today.
Excellent. I'm now going to move on to Eric Wind. Eric is joining us. Paul's joining us from the UK, and Eric, we welcome along Eric. Eric is joining us from the USA, and Eric owns Wind Vintage, a company that started in 2017 and that is dedicated to providing watches and advisory services to collectors about collecting watches. Like Paul, Eric also has a background in the auction industry, having worked for Christie's as a vice president and senior specialist for Christie's. So again, both Paul and Eric have a tremendous amount of experience with dealing with fine watches and for selling fine watches around the world at auction. Eric has featured in a number of publications, including, I'm just going to go through the list here, Eric, I hope you don't mind. Eric is featured in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Financial Times, and GQ. And since 2010, I think it was, Eric, you've been a contributor to Hodinkee as well. So combining watches with a writing passion as well. And has given lectures on watches. A particular example would be 2019, I think you gave a lecture to the Horological Society of New York about vintage watches and collecting, everything about collecting. And interesting, another interesting things about Eric. He's written a comprehensive guide to watches owned by US presidents. So it must have been an amazing piece of research for you to do that. So, and also, as well as that, Eric works with the film and TV and media productions, supplying watches for media, TV, and films production. So again, another very interesting aspect that I mentioned to your role.
Thank you, Richard. Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here.
You're brilliant. So look, conversation is about, we've also got Nick as well. Nick, are you going to join us as well?
I'd love to.
Excellent. Excellent. Welcome along, Nick. And Nick is very much involved as director with Mr. Watchmaster watch publication and is also joining us at this session. So welcome along, Nick.
Thank you.
and also I should say that Nick has an extensive background in media as well, related to horology, watches, and again, there's a lot of industry experience as well. So we should provide a good conversation here. So I'm going to, well, the focus is around auctions and watch collecting. So I'm going to sort of jump straight in by getting a few questions underway. So if we start, we talk about auctions. A good starting question would be, what has caught your attention lately in the auction market? What's auctions, either of a particular auction, a particular item, or particular trends that you're seeing at the moment? What sort of caught your imagination or interest? So I'm going to throw that question out to sort of an open the discussion.
Well, I mean, I think trends. I think there's a lot of talk about Nautilus, Nauts. I really do try to sort of tone those down in what I'm getting through information, because it's just a bit of a saturation point with those. But there's been some fantastic results across the board. The chocolate brown Speedmaster that sold. So there's some really exciting times, and I often get asked the question: are auctions still going to survive? Is online selling an interesting thing? Is that's the way it's going to go? But I think there's always room for auctions. Eric knows, he worked there at Christie's. I did 20 years, 17 at Bonhams and 3 at Philips. There's always going to be a platform there to sell those things. So there's always exciting things, because that's where the unheard of or unknown watches come.
Yeah.
Eric, when he was at Christie's and still does, finds really interesting watches. I found some most amazing watches going to sort of regional valuation days and picking up an amazing 369 Submariner in Glasgow office. And, these fresh to the market watches is what really all collectors want, whether it's a fresh to the market £3,000 Longines or a £50,000, £200,000 Rolex. It's the new stuff. If you follow the ultra market closely, you'll see a catalogue and you'll see, oh, it's a Patek Philippe 1463, but it's a watch which could have sold 11 times in the last 20 years. So, yeah, so I think there's always lots of exciting things coming up at the moment. I can see that, and I'm sure Eric can in the States as well. But I think the last 2 years has been interesting for every business with COVID.
Totally, and that's something I'm going to discuss a little bit in the next session. Eric, what stood out for you lately, or what trends, or what have you seen a particular item you thought, well, that's really interesting?
Yeah, so I think a few trends. First of all, the amount of people participating in auctions grown exponentially. So when you look at where I left Christie's in 2017, we had about 400 bidders register for our Geneva auctions then, which were world records, say 450. And now the amount of participants Philips stated in their auctions in 2021 was 10,000. So we're looking at a growth from about 500 people to 10,000 people, with millions more interested in watches generally. I think something like Hodinkee has something like 2 million unique visitors a month. So there are 2 million people that care enough to go onto a blog about watches, which is pretty serious. I think that all signs point to a very healthy market. There was, say, 6 years ago, a lot more interest in vintage than modern, but that's flipped. Vintage is still doing strong and pretty stable and established, but we've seen prices on like the 5711 go from 80K to 200K in kind of a 4-month period, and just all these watches that are going for astronomical amounts that are not rare. There's maybe 20,000 5711 blue dials out there, and the fact that they're all supposedly worth about $200,000 now is pretty insane when you think just about the total number that exist. So that's part of a healthy market. I would say a lot of people said that the year 2010 to 2020 was about the growth in vintage Rolex. The first Rolex to ever sell for over $1 million was in 2010 at auction. And by 2020, I think we were at 40 watches. And that was a big growing part of the auction market. Prior to that, it was essentially a lot of Breguet. Patek Philippe was kind of the king. Then Rolex came onto the scene. Now 2020 to people predicted 2030. It's the rise of the independents. You know, FP Journe watches selling for more than $4 at auction. No one thought we would see that. You know, Philippe Dufour selling for, you know, 5 million plus. That is kind of merging the art world with watches, because they're essentially living artists and we're supporting them and treating their watches like artwork. George Daniels, of course, you know, he obviously passed away, but people are treating his objects and watches like artwork. Roger Smith, obviously the protege, all of these things. So it's I don't think these independent watchmakers ever thought they'd be treated like you know, Picasso in his day or others, and with groupies ready to sleep with them, but they are rock stars now. So that's what, obviously, I would say the biggest trend of the last 2 years, and it'll be interesting to see how that will play out. I think it's very exciting.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. Nick, any observations yourself on what you're seeing in the market generally at the moment?
Yeah, I think, you know, if you go back certainly 10 years, 15 years when sort of I started, it was all about new watches. It was all about new watches. I remember almost getting a job with one of the most serious pre-owned watch, which, you know, it's, as far as what Paul and Eric do, obviously they're selling very good high price watches, and they're absolutely worth the money. Unfortunately, I never took that job with this particular company, but they've done quite well. But I think what we've seen is they've really they've changed the brand's attitude about collecting and pre-owned in an incredibly good way for everybody. Certainly for us, in terms of making it more. I hate using this mass market in the watch market. I mean, I remember going to see brands, and if you said collectors, you know, it was always a quiet society. But since then, they've all got involved with it. You know, and you know, every brand have amazing collectors, and you know, I'm obviously on the commercial side, and everybody wants to get a bit of that action. But I think that's what really has changed, and they're not frightened of it now. And they're being a lot more careful how they're distributing. So that's extrapolated itself by all the retailers now having their pre-owned departments. I mean, who would have believed that, you know, Harrods 7 years ago or whenever it was, you know, they started doing pre-owned. You know, so I think the key thing I'm looking at now, as not only a small collector, but very aware of how this business, it's a new business, has grown.
Absolutely. So, Paul, I'm going to pick up on just a comment we made, just to kind of talk a little bit about. I think one of the things about auctions is that chase, isn't it? It's going after and finding those pieces that are really fascinating out there. And you know, Paul, Eric, as previous in your previous world, as been auction specialists, heading up auction departments, etc. I mean, for you, what have been some of the great kind of watches that you've discovered that you just wouldn't believe that you would discover out there?
Well, I suppose, I mean, there's so many stories.
Yeah.
20 years of doing it, and some of them were very small, or some were just horologically so special and interesting. It wasn't so much the monetary value. I remember selling Patek Philippe 3974, which, for those who are not sure, it's a minute repeating Patek. And I remember taking the call one day, and a gentleman called. He says he's got a white gold watch, and it makes a sound when he rings it on the side. And I was, you know, okay, whereabouts are you? And luckily I had the A to Z on my desk at the time, and I opened the map. He said, I'm so-and-so. And I went, just made it completely up. I said, oh, I'm near there next week. And he went, oh, come along. And that was my in. Went to see him. He pulled up in his tractor, came out of his tractor, and got off with a minute repeating 3974 Patek. And it wasn't white gold, it was platinum. Took it into auction, sold it for, at the time, it was a record price. It was 355,000.
Yeah.
Did he buy a new tractor, Paul?
I think he did. I think he bought a new car.
He got a Lamborghini.
But it was bought by Davide Parmigiani, as a very well-known Italian dealer.
Yeah.
Incredible watch to have now. But yeah, there's so many of those watches.
Yes.
some come from small little valuation days you can do. I remember I went to Glasgow. One of my last clients came in with 4 pocket watches. Went through all the history of each of the pocket watches, and the combined value was perhaps £1,000. But just before they left, I noticed on his wrist he was wearing a Rolex, and it was an Explorer dial. And there we go. And took that in for sale. His wife was, wow, you know, it's that much money. I think I quoted something at the time, £30,000 to £40,000, and they'd had it valued 2 years previously for £1,500 by.
Wow.
It's a £150,000 watch now. We sold it for 80 at the time.
Yeah,
there's lots of great stories out there, but that's the thing, is as a collector, you like to try and find them. Eric has so many wonderful stories again about watches, but you know, I mean, the first time I met Eric was in 2010, wasn't it, Eric? When I took the Haslinger sale to New York.
Yes,
I think it was. Yeah, that was the first time we met, and you know, I got on with him straight away because he's so interested in the backstory of watches. It's just not the object. Obviously, he's got a business now. He's like me; he makes money out of it, and we all do. But it's the story that go with it, and it's how you portray those stories to collectors, which to me makes it interesting. I've collected for 30 years now, and I get just as much joy from a little Doxa chronograph than I do from a Rolex Daytona. So, yeah. I'm sure Eric's got lots of stories. I think he found some quite interesting watches very, very recently as well. Yeah,
I guess just a couple stories. One, there's an ad behind me there with a man on a bull, basically, and the watch. A gentleman named Gary LeFew, who was essentially a cowboy from California. And there's a big rodeo competition in Canada called the Calgary Stampede. And they have a, bull riding competition. So 1969, he's competing, he wins. Rolex is a sponsor for the event this year. They give him an Explorer, and then the requirement is that they take a photo on his wrist. So he's got his denim jacket on, you can see on the edge. And the watch basically a year later was in his gear bag, and a bull stepped on the bag, and the crystal totally smashed, and the hands kind of bent slightly, and the dial even bent. And he brought it somewhere to get a quote on servicing it, and he was, it was a passion job. You weren't paid a lot, so he was like, "Why am I going to get paid to get this thing repaired?" So it sat in his drawer until last year. He got divorced. Another young gentleman who's a young watch dealer I know, who was a rodeo clown as a teenager, saw the ad, and it kind of mixed his two passions of rodeo and watches. So he met Gary and was like, "Do you have the watch? Can you get you know where it is?" Gary looked all over, he didn't know. And then he said, "Why don't you contact my ex-wife and ask her?" She had it in a sock in a drawer, basically, and then shipped it to him. And then you can see clearly the watch has the same details as the watch in the photo, and got it restored, serviced, and it's working perfectly now. But it's just insane to have the watch that's in that ad.
That's brilliant.
Yeah.
I think that's one of the things, isn't it? It's about that. It's about what it's about, the not knowing what might come next. Yeah. And that's the fun of it, And then I think that's a major thing for Collect as well, about what's out there, what might be coming, and that's the exciting part, I think, about collecting. Very much so.
Yeah.
So, I mean, reflecting on the last couple of years, and I'm just sort of looking in my notes here, maybe at one stage there was a kind of a feeling that auction houses were a bit like, going in there was a bit of a barrier. Was it going to be kind of too kind of upmarket for collectors, etc. And I think a lot of that's gone over the last 5-10 years or so. I think definitely. But I think, would it be fair to say that over the last 2 years, where so much of it has been online, and Eric, you quoted some of the figures about what we're seeing in terms of numbers of people coming into auctions, etc., online, etc. Would it be fair to say that that online has made it more accessible for buyers, and with a sort of a feeling, well, I think I could try that. So I think we're starting to see so much more volume in terms of numbers of people interested in coming online and bidding that way. Yeah, just for everyone. Yeah.
Yeah. Online has helped a lot with. It has allowed the auction houses to get a lot more watches through than just have their keynote auctions in Hong Kong, New York every year. So they kind of have year-round cycles where they do almost monthly auctions for Christie's and Sotheby's. By the way, the other big thing to mention is typically the big auction houses at most would do about 100 million in turnover. And this past year, Phillips did 208 million US dollars and Christie's did 206 million, I believe. So we never thought we would see $200 million at auction over a year without expansive growth in staff or things like that. But it's essentially the same amount of staff. So it's really the value of the watches increasing drastically. So yeah, it makes it more accessible, no question.
Yeah. So just moving on from that, I'm interested in this. I'm going to throw this into the question here. There was a kind of, if you like, view that you could go into an auction house somewhere and find a bargain. If you imagine there's some auction house, you find something, you go in, you bid for it, you get a bargain. So, in today's world where everything is talked about on medias, on posted, talked about is online, etc., is the day of finding a bargain or watch bargain over?
No, I don't believe so.
Good.
You've got to give everyone hope.
Yeah. I'm pleased by your answer, Paul, because I think you can still go out there and find things.
An awful answer if I said no. There's never a chance. You have to all stop now. No, I think there's always that. Obviously, there's more interaction, there's media, there's more exposure. But you still find it's about doing your research, doing your homework, and the effort you put in is what you get out of it. I mean, I found a wonderful Memovox the other day, and I bought it at a local auction house for £700, and a beautiful steel jumbo Memovox. And there are still bargains there. You still have to know what you're looking for. It helps if the crystal is completely crazed that everyone stays away from it.
You can see the value. You look. I bought a watch like that once at auction. The crystal was gone, but I looked at the dial through the crystal as hard as I could, and it looked okay. And I thought, right, that should be all right.
Yeah.
Those are the things that you get from collecting. So as soon as I saw the watch, I thought, right, it's on a sprung elasticated bracelet. That means they were very popular in the 1960s and 70s, and my grandfather's watch, my late grandfather had one, and when he passed away, so it's that it's not being sold to a dealer, and it's fresh to the market. The crystal's crazed and it's a bit worn. That's the sort of thing I look for. So I knew the dial. Okay, it wasn't 100%, but I knew the dial would be good under that crystal. It's not being replaced. So those are the things you have to sort of the little signs you look for, and then you take a little bit of a chance. But there's lots out there. There's a saturation of information, but there's still bargains.
Yeah, good. Eric, your thoughts on the subject?
I agree. Even in the keynote auctions, it's kind of hard to find a quote bargain at Philips. But they're relatively undervalued pieces that you'll find all the time.
Yes. And I think that also speaks, Nicole, if you've got any comments on that, please do come in. So I think it speaks also to the fact that collecting, as I see it, is a passion across so many different levels that so much attention goes to discussion about, let's say, a Nautilus or a Rolex or something like that. But there are many other forms, there are many other watches out there, and all of them seem to have a group of passionate people following them, which I find really interesting.
Absolutely. I mean, I live in sunny Suffolk in the middle of nowhere, but we have our local auction houses, and you could make it into a full-time job just going through the auction houses and seeing what's popping up and whatever. And there's certainly still deals to be done. And I think watches have always been a difficult subject to talk about. You've never sort of really seen big TV programs on watches, but when you look at the mass market again, things like the Antiques Roadshow, there's so many people opening their bedroom sort of side drawer and thinking, oh my God, I've got something in there.
Yeah.
One thing I wanted to sort of add, and you know, that's a great question, because I think it has got a little bit misty, the whole business of not collecting, but you know, what is that watch? Because what commission is going to be charged? Are you being given the fair price or the right price? And there are a lot of people involved. Is whether there is, you know, is there? And this is really, sorry to take your questioning away, Richard. This is for Paul and Eric. Is there, what kind of policing is out there these days? Because you know, when dealers came on and that other word called the grey market sort of came in, and that was for pre-owned watches as well, sort of came in quite a while ago, is there was no kind of policing, and it was kind of like the Wild West of watches. And I'm just wondering, guys, Paul and Barrett, where do we see that going? And you know, it's all about protecting the customer, because you can do it once, and you know, they never come back to you. And you know, I'm very pleased to join this panel with you, Paul and Eric, only just to see how, you know, how to give a slight insight to how you do it, and you know, how do I become somebody like you? I don't want to become, but I'm just saying, I think it's useful for the consumer to know, you know, what's good and what's the right sort of angles to take before you are fleeced or not fleeced.
Yeah, I mean, I think you always have to, if you're buying a watch from a dealer or somebody or any source really, is doing just as much homework on that person as you do on the watch. Like you would do if you're going to buy a car, or buy a house, you would at least drive up to the house beforehand and check the area out and make sure everything's okay. So with a watch, you just got to really look into the person who's selling it. And somebody like myself or Eric, there's hundreds of people out there who have a reputation, a good reputation, and who do their homework and do their due diligence on the watch. And you know, there's for myself, I check every watch I sell on the watch database, and that's a sort of UK-based database. Then they go on to places like Rolex and Patek Philippe and checked and verified before the person will buy that watch from me. So, right. Yeah, so there's an element of trust, but you know, there's a lot of people, I've known a lot of people who've gone out there and just bought, you know, considerable amounts of money on a watch, and it's been completely wrong. Not from an auction, but just from somebody who was selling a watch, because there's so many more people selling watches now, because there's so much more on the subject. Before there wasn't so many. There was a few auction houses, obviously big auction houses, but everybody wants to be a watch dealer now. You know, just because they've got an Instagram account, they suddenly, you know, they class themselves as a reputable person selling watches. But you know, they've literally formed an Instagram account a year ago, and now you're suddenly going to wire them $40,000 US. Yeah. You know, why would you? But yeah, so I mean, you know, it's, you know, at auction as well, you go to speak to the specialists. They're full of people, generally full of people with knowledge on the subject, and they're not there to push you a hard sell on a watch. They're there to sell you a sort of watch, but obviously give you the right information that you want. So yeah, I mean, there's plenty out there, but you know, you've got to do your homework.
Yeah. Eric, do you have any thoughts on that? And it'll segue very nicely into my next question. So, Eric, thoughts on that?
I agree wholeheartedly with Paul. I don't really have much to add.
So, you only buy from Eric in the States and me in the UK. That's all we're saying.
Oh, you go. There's the best advice.
Exactly.
So it does segue actually that question into my next question, which was to say, look, you know, for the collector who would like to attend an auction, and you know, there will be people on this, you know, call who may never have attended an auction, either online or live. You know, how do they maximize their opportunity to bid? And I'm not necessarily going to say walk away with something they might bid, or more particularly to learn from the experience. And and for me, I'm going to digress a second. For me, and you know, watch viewings are coming back in now. You can personally go, and you know, online is great. There's tremendous photographs of watches, but one of the things I used to find, and I'm starting to get back into now, is the watch viewing, where you have an opportunity to get a sense of a lot of watches together, which gives you a kind of an historic and also an in-depth understanding of watches. You can sort of walk down from things that were produced in the 16th century as pocket watches right through to something made in 2020. And it gives you an innate knowledge of kind of stopping and looking at these things, which you can do in a viewing. I think viewings are kind of undervalued in terms of the ability just to go and talk, take time to look at something. You know, there's the viewing, talk to specialists, doing your research, which is kind of like what we just talked about, maybe having some sort of plan when you go into an auction, how much are you going to spend? But it's also more practical things like knowing what are the fees, you know, what's it going to cost when I buy this thing on top of, you know, the buyer's premium, etc. Or indeed, if you're selling a watch via an auction, understanding fully again the fees, what's going to cost, what's the advantages of going at auction, what's the advantage of just selling it, you know, to a dealer, etc., etc. So it's really that question, what would you suggest to people who haven't been to an auction as to how they can maximize their experience in going to an auction? Broad question.
Well, I think first off is just go to an auction. I mean, people, when for 20 years, I often got people say, how much do I have to pay to attend the auction? I was like, well, no, it's a free public auction. Yeah. Some of them, particularly the car sales, you have to buy a catalogue for entry. But the watches weren't necessarily like that. Sometimes in Geneva they are. It's about numbers in the room and stuff. But yeah, just go along to an auction. There's New York and London and Geneva, and sit and watch the room and see how it works before you go in. Also, obviously COVID stopped a lot of the physical viewing, and online sales, as Eric alluded to earlier, have escalated. And long may that continue, but there's nothing beats holding the watch in your hand. I mean, tangible objects. You need to be able to look at it, study the case, and see the difference between, a polished and unpolished, and what the NOS, new old stock, actually is, or what overused words. So there's lots of information you can get there before you go in, and obviously all the fees for an auction house, for a buyer or seller, are laid out and very easy to understand. Just know that, when you're bidding, set your price and don't go above that price. The worst sales, as Eric will probably remember, is the charity auctions. The ones where there's a dinner, because when people have a few drinks, that is, I would have so many people call me and say, "Oh, I bought Harry Winston, whatever, and charity auction, and my wife made me buy it, and they've spent £80,000 on a £15,000 watch, So yeah, the information is there, but it's getting the object in your hand, whether it's just a low value £500 watch or whatever. You need, and that's how you learn as well. That's how I learned, is handling the sale of many watches, in pretty low grade sales, building up, and from a Piaget to a Longines to a Cartier, it's a broad church watch collecting, and there's different sections within it, watches and everything. But yeah, you've got to handle these watches. And, like saying, when me and Eric met in New York, he came to the Haslinger sale, which is a single owner collection of Hoyer watches. And, they were all amazing, weren't they, Eric? And it was just a wonderful experience seeing all these American collectors really looking at this one person's passion into one cycle, and you handle them, and yeah, it was a great time. And that's the good thing about auctions, you can do that, and you can learn from them.
Yeah. Eric, any thoughts on that subject? What's the best way to maximize your experience of going to an auction?
I agree again wholeheartedly with Paul. Very important. Watches are a tactile hobby, and it's not just two-dimensional. So I always talk to collectors about how something wears, because that really will ultimately affect your enjoyment. Certain people like a very heavy watch. I like watches that are a little bit lighter, so I tend towards steel personally. But everything feels different. The way the lugs are curved on your wrist, everything else is very hard to tell. You can't tell just from a photo, first of all. Second, one error I see people make is that they think the auction house experts are their friends, and they can be, but they ultimately represent the seller, not the buyer. So in general, condition reports are more favorable to the watch than maybe an outside expert would say. Obviously, the descriptions are much more flowery and positive because they're paid on how well it will do. And you know, unfortunately, if you tell the auction house, I'm going to go to $100,000 on this watch, in many cases, you'll find yourself ending up paying $100,000 when it would otherwise go for $50,000. That's called shill bidding and is illegal, but unfortunately, it does happen as far as I'm aware. So the auction experts are very valuable to talk with. I wouldn't buy a watch without talking to an expert who may have consigned the watch, learn the origin. Was it consigned by original owner or dealer? What's the story? Where has the watch been? Because provenance is much clearer with artwork. So if you're buying an important painting, you know where it's been. It's been in these exhibitions and these families' collections. It's not the case with watches, unfortunately, at this point. Yeah,
good. Nick, if I can put you on the spot here, have you attended a few auctions over your years, and have you learned anything from there?
I always tie my hands down when I go down there because I'm very much entertained by the big brands, and they're very, very, very nice to me. But it's very, 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 very easy to get sort of sucked in because you want one and you might be getting a good deal on it. So I now have noticed going to a few auctions now is a lot more people are bringing loose so they can see it, or a magnifying glass. I think people need to be really, really observant and looking in numbers of the back of the case and how, so that really delving deep into the watch in terms of its condition. I've been hit on a couple of buys that I've done and they're not what I thought they were, and I think everybody makes mistakes, but make sure they're small mistakes, not big mistakes. Just to get what Paul said about charity investments, that's probably been one of my mishaps, where the hand goes up because the champagne's taken over. I mean, it's great for the charity, and I don't deny that at all. But it's very, very easy to be taken in. But no, I mean, I think what the guys have just said, it's as you say, doing your homework, and there's no such thing as a free lunch, especially now, because it is becoming a very, very crowded market. I think we just again to Paul and Eric is what's without giving your trade secrets away, what's kind of hot at the moment and what's cold. Leave the cold out, but what's give some of our viewers a bit of an insight in terms of, without giving your trade secrets away, if I may ask that. If you don't want to answer it, I totally understand, but it would be nice to sort of what's to keep an eye on in 5 years' time or 10 years' time, or
so there's been a lot of movement on the modern side, obviously, with the Gerald Genta design watches, Nautilus, Royal Oak, Vacheron 222s. I never thought the Vacheron overseas would be as hot as it's gotten now that they're like lagging behind, but 50-year wait lists for those now. Just to show you how that market's changed, Vacheron had a super hard time selling any watches a few years ago. And I knew someone who was in charge of wholesale, and he was taking the kind of $19,000 overseas. They had like 400 overstock that he sold across 47th Street in New York for like $3,000 to $4,000 each, because they had to. He said his tears were pouring down his eyes because that was the order he got from above to liquidate. And now, those watches are $40,000, $50,000 and up. So it's just insane. But obviously, these kind of integrated bracelet watches, first of all. Second, Lange has gotten incredibly hot, interestingly enough, the older pieces. I sold one early on, 4 years ago for $13,000, and that watch is $80,000 now because it was a very early Lange one. The condition aspect of all original, untouched, unpolished, or vintage Rolex sport watches, that kind of value difference between an average condition and excellent condition continues to grow, and it's much easier to sell an excellent condition watch at a higher price than sort of a mediocre condition piece, you know, at a far less price, say 50% less or something like that, depending on the watch. Those are kind of general trends. Now we're seeing everyone's always looking for the next thing. So there's the Gerald Genta brand that used to be very difficult to sell. That's taken off. These Mickey Mouse watches, you know, all the variety of interesting character watches he had. You know, I think those probably have a pretty bright future. Even Rolex watches with logos on the dial, Domino's Pizza, other brands, these have spiked in the last 2 years, as people are looking for cool stories to tell and something that not everyone else has.
Yeah, I think, yeah. Paul, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, exactly.
Sorry, guys. You may have noticed I've joined the party.
I know.
So I was just going to be winding up. So,
well, I mean, I think what Eric said, Lang and so on, you know, there's a big interest in those. I think Philips are actually doing an exhibition next week here in London with the Lange 1 and Saxomat, I believe. So yeah, Cartier is a big area which, you know, has changed dramatically in the last couple of years. Really, some of the prices incredible. I mean, a year and a bit ago, I sold a Cartier Crash for £50,000, which was a Paris edition, 1994. It's £120,000 now, probably, isn't it? So yeah, just in a space of a year and a bit. And I mean, the lady who owned it, she went, "Oh, I wish I'd kept it." And I was like, "Well, I bought it from you. I wish I'd kept it too." You know, but you know, so there's areas there, but it's not just the top Cartier. It's you know, even like the Pashas and the earlier the more simplistic models. There's a market for them, but they've always been an amazing watch. It's suddenly once people get into it, they really get into it, and you know, Instagram is a big factor in that. I think there's the amount of information we get, seeing Cartiers all the time. People thinking, well, "Gosh, I think I need to get a Cartier."
Yeah,
you know,
yeah.
Until they put it on and realize it's actually quite a small and quite a feminine looking watch on the wrist, the Cartier Crash. And you know, I wore the one I had for a week, and I didn't get on with it. You know, so you know, it's a popular, desirable watch, but for me personally, it's not one I'd like to own for long term. So. But Eric said, there's the independents are flying at the moment.
Yes.
But so also the independent, more affordable watches, Baltic, Mari, the collaboration watches, Messina, Unimatic, and they're all really interesting pieces. I'm a sucker for those.
Just to add to that, I think Seiko's moving up with Grand Seiko a little bit now. I may be wrong, but I think they've now positioned themselves where they are in a position where it's all about the beauty and how well it's made. But you know, I just threw that in there because you know, not everybody who's watching this can afford the, you know, Langers and whatever. But it's just trying to judge the market. Yeah.
You can buy a Furlan Mari for £450.
Yeah.
And they're independent brand. Kickstarter. They won the GPHG last year for design. You know, they're very interesting, and you know, there's, you know, obviously it looks like a Patek 1463. Yeah, hey, I love chronographs, so I'm a sucker for those. So, yeah.
Good. Andrew, have I got room for one more question?
One more, absolutely. Yeah, let's finish up on that.
So we'll just say thank you very much to everyone. So I think, you know, I think you've answered the question, which is almost to say, well, look, in a world where we have seen some incredible, what you might call Super League prices for some of these watches more recently, you know, and also watches are now tracked, you know, and against a pool of investment commodities, like whether it be art or whether it be jewelry or whether it be even handbags or sneakers. There's this whole element of how it's tracked at the moment. There's some results out about that, for example, this morning. But the question is, which I'm expecting and hoping you will give me the yes to, is there is still room for the enthusiast collector in the market. That's what I'd like to enjoy collectors.
Always.
The thing is, you will always get investment in areas. It's like the car world I work with. But at the end of the day, these are fueled by passion for people, and they can be passion and lots of many things. And the air is thin up there. Not many people can go out and buy a £1 million Patek Philippe. No. You know, I'm glad there are, but not many people can. But lots of people can afford £1,000 or $2,000 watch, and take a lot of enjoyment from that.
Exactly.
You know, and that's what it's all about. And that's why, you know, it's always been of interest to me, this you know, watches and stuff. So it's been able to go out and find that thing, buy it, enjoy it, wear it, and talk to your peers about it.
Absolutely. Eric, you concur?
Yeah, the reality is watches are probably the one thing we have in our life that'll last 500 years plus, and that down to future generations. So that they'll actually care about and keep. So I think I remain very bullish about the mechanical watch and its future.
Brilliant.
And they're useful.
Yeah,
that too.
I know you don't need it, but it does have it is a very useful thing.
Excellent.
Great.
Nick, do you want to wrap up before I hand back to Andrew to sort of wrap things up? Any final comments from yourself?
Yeah, I think watches are cars, really, except they last probably a bit longer, and they're less expensive. And you know, it's all about passion and loving what you're wearing. And it sort of goes back to the original interview we had this morning with George Bamford and Simon de Burton. One very famous collector said to me, if I can mention it, and I don't want to be put off air, but it's like cocaine. Once you've had one sniff, you want more.
Addictive, yes, absolutely.
It's probably the appropriate time I hand back to Andrew.
Yeah.
Thanks, Richard.
Meanwhile, the lawyers are on the line.
Thank you, Paul. Tremendous. And thank you, Eric. And thank you, Nick. Tremendously appreciated. Really, really great to have your input. Thank you. I'm going to hand back to Andrew now.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Eric. And thank you, Nick. So, wow, there it is. I think it's been a brilliant day. We heard from George Bamford, as Nick just mentioned, about his magpie collecting tendencies. We met the super collectors, Sid, Anthony and Michael, who gave us a great insight into what to collect and how we should go about it. It was also great to hear from Aurelie and JL, who believe that we should redefine luxury watches and the definition of collecting from a gender perspective. Very interesting. And there we've just had our final session, which gave a fascinating perspective on the pre-owned and auction market. Well, I've certainly enjoyed today, and I want to thank everyone that took part and gave up their time, which is precious, to be part of the Ultraluxe Watches event.